welcome back to the Creating Synergy podcast. Today on the show, we have a truly exceptional guest and one of the most brilliant minds I've encountered, Tobi Pearce, co-founder of Sweat. I was thrilled to chat to Tobi on the show and to learn how he built a $400 million fitness empire that transformed the lives of millions of people around the world. From humble beginnings where he was at one point living at the back of his car to scaling Sweat into a global brand, we'll deep dive into Tobi's journey. He shares with us the many lessons that he's learned and the principles that he's applied to grow both himself and the business. We'll explore his mindset when it comes to learning how to learn, how to focus your time and energy, and how to build a world-class culture of excellence. Tobi provides so much insight for the budding entrepreneurs. He provides insight for the CEOs who are looking to work on the business and not in it, and also for business leaders looking to create positive habits of transformation. So without further ado, let's dive into our conversation with Tobi Pearce. So welcome back to the Creating Synergy podcast. Today on the show, we have a great man. I've actually been super keen to do this podcast for a very long time. Tobi Pearce, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, mate.
So obviously known for being the founder of Sweat, building an empire. Well done and kudos on your journey there.
Thank you very much.
I have had someone that you know very, very well on the show, Sarah Siami, back in the day. I think we interviewed her back in the middle of COVID days and she was talking to us about your growth and journey. So we know a little bit about the Sweat story. But before we jump into any of that, I'd be really open if you could share with us your earliest context so we can get to know who was Tobi and where did you come from and how did you become the man that you are today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess as adults, we're really just a kind of grown reflection of ourselves as children, right?
Absolutely.
So I grew up in a very small town. I went to a primary school with 20 or 30 people, I think, in it at one point, so it was quite little.
In South Australia?
Yeah, in South Australia, in the wine region, which we're famous for, obviously, here. I was your typical sort of very skinny high school music nerd. That was me. But I had
because you're a piano player, aren't you?
Yeah. I properly studied for probably, 15 to 17 years. I still play now, but I've been playing since I was sort of, 3-4 years old.
Yeah, wow.
So I was the sort of like the music nerd, but a bit of a rebel. So I did get expelled from one school, mostly for not showing up that often.
Mostly?
Mostly, yeah.
No need to go into that.
No. But yeah, so I was a little bit of a rat bag. I didn't find the traditional education system sort of very stimulating. Very late in high school, I think early to middle of year 12, I left home. Sort of lived either by myself, sort of on the streets, or with friends or whatever for a portion there. Eventually, for anyone listening from overseas, we have a thing called a stat test, which you can sit in Australia to get into uni if you didn't do very well in high school, because I only just passed. I was right on the brink of failure for year 12. And I got a score high enough that let me get into a double degree in law and commerce, which I subsequently dropped out of several years later.
Yep.
But I didn't really know what I wanted to do. All I really knew was that, sort of from probably 12 or 13 years old, I really liked business. I really liked numbers.
Was there an entrepreneurial flair there? Did you start anything in your early years?
Not very young, but sort of. I started working in a music shop when I was 13, and that was a sort of family-owned, small business. And I worked in, music sales, piano sales, stock ordering, debt collection, rentals. I cleaned the showroom floor. I delivered pianos. I had a truck license. I did. So I was probably, to be honest, quite fortunate, that I landed there, because that was actually off the back of a school work experience program, and I went there just because I played piano. There was no real other logic to it. And so I got quite a lot of experience there. I kind of worked. I mean, we didn't even have sort of proper reporting structures, but I effectively reported to the owner. Who at the time was sort of in his early to mid 30s, and was running a very successful business. So I kind of got exposure, and probably maybe a better word than exposure is the freedom, to kind of explore a variety of different work
and learn the hustle a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I was, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16, and I was, on a plane with him, sort of going to Japan and China,
Yeah, wow.
buying pianos and wheeling and dealing things over there, which at that time I probably didn't really understand that was quite cool.
And quite unique in a way, like from
Yeah.
your parents letting you head overseas and
Yeah.
with someone that they don't really know very well.
Yeah, true. But yeah, so no, I learned a lot about that. I mean, you learn a lot just traveling generically, but doing it for business and kind of going to regional Japan and China, you learn quite a lot. So yeah, I mean, I eventually left there and got into personal training. The personal training thing was one, I liked working out because I started going to the gym after high school, and two, I couldn't sort of work full-time hours 9 to 5, which is what I ended up doing at the music shop when I left school. I couldn't keep working there and do a full-time double degree. And I was sort of like against this notion of being at uni for 10 years because I was like, that just doesn't really make sense to me. So yeah, I ended up going into personal training, and that was sort of where my first, I would say, like true, fully independent, entrepreneur experience began. But I mean, even before that, like I would work at the music shop in the morning. I would do after hours work at, a restaurant as a dishy. I would do after hours work, for late night shopping at a clothing store. Like I was working like 80 to 100 hour weeks just straight out of school, and even sort of at the end of school as well. I just loved it.
Is that because, and I have read that I think you've mentioned that you were homeless at one point. Is that just so you could make ends meet? Is that why you just decided I need to work?
I think so. I mean, I like towards the end of high school, I had a couple of stints where I was sort of in between, places. I spent the majority of year 12 sort of living, at friends' houses and that, and even shortly after, I spent the majority of that sort of first couple of years living at friends' houses. And so towards the end of school, and I honestly can't even really understand why, but I decided to stay and finish. So I didn't really have a lot of time to work, so I just tried to find work. And then as soon as I finished, I like all of the hours that I otherwise would have been at school, I just traded directly for work and kind of got quite deeply into it. And that was really, like, I think the money thing was certainly a part of it. I mean, to be frank, I wasn't exactly shooting the lights out.
Yeah.
I was making a couple of $100 a week.
Yeah.
But it was more so
16, 17, that's not too bad.
Not too bad, yeah. But I had a massive chip on my shoulder.
Yeah, okay.
Like full transparency. I had a huge chip on my shoulder, like, I got to prove to the world and do all this sort of stuff. And so at that point in time, and when you're that age, you're not really thinking that much about intelligent work. It's just work more, make more. Like you have this very fundamental and basic understanding of, well, I trade time for money.
Yeah, it's basic transaction.
Yeah.
So when you're working all these hours, I'm interested in how did you find yourself? I mean, I've read that you were living out of a car, and how did you find yourself in that position? And then what was the transition to, moving into a home that you actually owned or rented?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think about the exact sequence, but I mean, ultimately, like after school and working a lot of the hours and whatever, I eventually, went through and did a PT qualification, which then allowed me to transition from, sort of working 3 or 4 jobs to bridge all the hours that I wanted to work into sort of working one job, which was just mine, my own sort of little business. At this point, I sort of started renting a place and, doing all the sort of more, I guess, like conventional, teenage, person stuff.
Yeah.
And because I was able to kind of set my, my own price and my own hours and sort of run my own business at that point, I was able to then go to uni. So I was doing a full-time double degree whilst, running my PT business.
Yeah, wow.
And the issue that presented me was, cash in hand was a much larger incentive than like some delayed certificate at uni. But that was my issue early on. But then sort of after about 6 or 12 months of doing personal training, I was already making a few $100,000 a year on a run rate basis. And so
just purely from the hours that you were putting in.
Yeah. And so like that's cool. Yeah. But the issue that it presented me was that the more money that I made and the more independence I generated, the less interest I had in going to uni and waiting around. Because I kind of went from doing individual personal training to small groups in a gym, and then I set up my own, a couple of my own franchises doing female-only group fitness.
Yeah.
And you had a couple of people working for me and doing all of that sort of stuff. And so, the combination of those things, sort of started to push me closer towards 7 figures. And then so it was at that point in time that I really sort of started to say, like, do I really like, do I really want to, do this whole uni thing? Of course, then I stumbled across the internet and social media, and about this time, I'd put together a couple of books or ebooks, which I would sell to my clients and sell to some corporates and whatnot to kind of educate on healthy eating and training and all this sort of stuff. Which was the super simple logic was like, well, I can't fit any more people in. Here's how I train. If you want to follow it, you can. It's $50 or whatever. And that was kind of the origin of what ended up becoming the first version of the ebook business online, which ultimately then became Sweat. The issue that I had kind of with, making a little bit of money and then sort of questioning university then got completely blown out of the water because I went from making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to millions overnight. And so
Just
it was
off the back of the ebook.
Yeah. And so, I recruited more people to take over all the training so I didn't have to do it, so I could focus on the online stuff. It was actually my birthday that year. I caught up with my parents for a birthday dinner, and at the dinner I sort of, partway through we're eating, I sat down, I was like, oh, look, I'm probably going to disappoint you when I say this, but I've decided to leave university. And there was a lot of silence. There was a lot of silence at that table because the way I was raised, I don't know if I'm going to get this all right, but I think my dad has 2 degrees or a degree and a master's. My mum has, I don't know, like 3, 4, 5, education, psychology, nursing, the list kind of goes on. Yeah. And the mentality was very much traditional and old school. It's even if you never use the certificate that you get, just go and get it just in case because you can fall back onto it. That was always the mentality. And there's some practicality in that. I just didn't agree at the time for a variety of reasons.
My family had a different thought process. It was get a government job and then
and that's sort of like really in a lot of sort of English speaking Western countries that's quite conventional. That was.
So can I ask, like, you've met Vin Jang? Have you met Vin Jang?
No, sorry.
Vin's he's a South Australian. He's a communication expert. Been on the show. Got over 1 million followers on. I can't believe you don't know him. No. He's fantastic. I should connect you both. He's the same thing. So he's a magician that turned keynote speaker. He's flown all around the world. Yeah. And his parents, he's Asian background, and he said, my parents thought I was a failure because I wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. And he's pretty open about it. It's quite funny. And he said when he told them that he was moving out of, like, quitting university to follow his magic career, because he started off as a magician, his parents were quite upset. Yeah. But then when he showed them the paycheck for one magic act that he did, which was 10 grand, they're like, how can I be your manager, right?
Yeah.
Did your parents, flip their decision when they understood what more? No, they were still, wow.
No. So that I guess, like, perspective has pretty much been maintained. And it's worth noting as well, like, for the first, I don't know, sort of 3 to 5 years of my more serious professional career, everything was incredibly private. So my parents had no idea.
Yeah, okay.
All they knew was that it was more money than personal training. They didn't really know much else.
But isn't that why you go to uni, so you can earn an income that can, like, pay for your?
Well, I mean, in these sort of scenarios, and especially with sort of traditionalist mindsets, ultimately it's a flawed ideology, right? And so if that's something that's been instilled in them and or something they've lived with for a long time, it's who's the silly person, the one who's telling someone to do something, or the one who's arguing with someone who's lived that way for 50 years.
True, so stop banging your head against the wall.
Yeah, I never really engaged in the argument, and I think as well, like, I at that point in time in my life, and just something about me which is probably quite different to most people at that point in their life, I was fully comfortable with the accountability. So if I completely failed and lost everything, like, I was totally cool with that.
Which is probably half the reason why you succeeded.
Yeah, because a lot of people will go, oh, like, I hate uni and I don't want to be here and this and that and the other, but then they're not really considering, well, okay, well, if you had it, don't be there, and they go, oh, well, no, that's too accountable. And but then what this, what that, and I'm like, well, okay, that's your prerogative. Mine was, I'm like, oh, well, if everything screws up, I have faith in my intelligence. I'll go and get a degree and do something else.
Well, I can always fall back to going back to personal training, right? Like,
correct.
At the very least, you had a base there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, I mean, like most things in life, but in this particular context in business, most things get ruined by people's inability to regulate emotions. And in this particular case, fear. It's that fear of failure or the fear of the unknown, the uncertainty, or public demise or whatever that people want to kind of avoid. But on a practical basis, it's highly irrational.
How do you regulate your fear or your emotion?
Well, a lot of practice.
Yeah, like are you there yet? I mean, I'm definitely not. And I get told, not on a daily basis, but every now and again, people can see my emotions on my face.
Yeah,
I'm interested because it's an area I think. If you are leading a company or or anything, sport, whatever it is, the ability to stay calm and provide vision and direction is paramount.
Yeah.
How do you regulate your emotion?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, from one of the macro things here, right, is that I think a lot of people make a very unfortunate and flawed assumption about this, and they start from the position that I'm super emotional, and then they get a whole bunch of feedback that's not good for whatever reason. Society feeds that back to them, and then they generate this belief that, well, if I'm hyper emotional or just emotional to any degree, which we all are, myself included, and I get negative feedback about that, well, therefore the goal must be to be not emotional at all. And that's very inaccurate, right? The reality is that as human beings, we're always going to be emotional. The variable is not so much do we not feel emotions. It's to what degree do we let the emotion dictate our behavior.
Okay.
Right. So there's a subtle distinction between having and not having emotions versus having them, but then not letting them dictate your behavior. And
so there's a gap, right? Stimulus response in between. There's a gap.
Yeah. And a lot of people, fundamentally understand that, but then the complexity goes, something, ABC happened and now I'm really angry, or, I'm really sad, or, whatever it is. But it takes time. There's an intellectual component of this, like actually understanding what's happening and why. What are your emotions? Why do we have them? How do you define them? In what context do they present themselves? There's this intellectual and educational part. And then there's a more kind of tactile, experiential component of it, which is how do you recognize that and feel that and capture it in real time? So an equivalent might be if you look at a sport athlete. Michael Jordan's always a great example. He's not even really he's unconsciously competent. He's so good that he's never really thinking about much. It's kind of just happening. The opposite of the spectrum is unconsciously incompetent. So most people are completely unaware that their emotions are taking control. So this is a skill acquisition process, no different to playing a sport. And a lot of people will conventionally say, well, we study for the intellectual component. Maybe for the more tactile, experiential part, maybe we meditate. Maybe we reflect and we journal. Maybe we have a coach that we talk to sort of break down these reflections. So there's a lot of practice involved with doing that, and a lot of people, unfortunately, want to simplify it to don't have emotions, which, in my opinion, is probably, if we come back to the leadership perspective, leading with no emotions is fundamentally flawed, in my opinion, in the sense that you need to be able to make decisions from a commercial perspective without your emotions interfering. But everyone that you're leading has emotions. And by virtue of that, you must be able to understand them. And to understand them, you must be able to understand yourself. Therefore, you must be emotionally driven. So it's a little counterintuitive, but a lot of people get lost in the oversimplification, right? They have a low fidelity view, if you will.
So staying within the spectrum of what an emotion should be, right? You don't go over that line, you don't go below that line, you stay in what is a Goldilocks zone, I guess. And
well, you even think about it this way, right? To the example you use is that there's a stimulus, and then there's the response, and then in between the two there's this space, which we call choice, right? But there's also another way of looking at that, and that is that, well, does the way you feel in business really need to have any link to the decision that you make, right? So for example, you're trying to do a big business deal. I'll use my own experience, at Sweat. We went through one, and 36 hours before it was meant to come to a close, it ended up falling over. It cost me more than $10 million of my own money. It was a massive public failure because I'd guaranteed a whole bunch to, the team, which was, a bit of a learning from my part in management and leadership. In that particular scenario, I can sit there and be really angry. I can be really angry because something's got in our way. Sad because I've lost out something, embarrassed because I've just had failure in front of a huge bunch of people, and then the natural response to those combination of emotions would be to recluse. It would be to run away and hide for a lot of people, right?
Correct.
That's a terrible decision from a leadership and management perspective.
Agreed.
If you want to set a culture that welcomes learning and failure, you have to acknowledge your own, right? And so in that case, you might have stimulus choice and response, right? But the stimulus, the emotion in this particular case, and the choice don't necessarily actually have to have any relation to each other. That's not necessarily a rule, it's a useful principle to live by, but if you're constantly making decisions with the emotions being the key variable that you consider, well, then don't ever expect to make a lot of money in the long term, because the commercial transactions, if you're doing a very big deal with a bunch of investment bankers or M&A people or acquirers, they're not worried about if you're happy, sad, or otherwise.
Yeah.
They're worried about if the transaction makes sense. They need to feel good about it, right? But your decisions have to be quite rational and practical. They can't be emotionally driven.
Do you think the skill comes from the continuation of making mistakes in that space where you learn? Or can you go from, I know, we know this, you can't just go from being at one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. You have to get better. And that's why they say, look, recently we did the podcast with Mark Randolph, the co-founder of Netflix. And one of his quotes that he said was that you learn as much. Saying that you can learn entrepreneurship from a book is the same as you can learn playing golf from a book, right? It's you have to be able to play golf for you to learn it. Do you think the same goes with controlling emotions? You just have to be in it. You have to be in amongst it. You have to be overwhelmed, build resilience, all the above.
Yeah, I think to a degree. Again, it's like I think it's a great quote. I'd probably suggest, rather than it being kind of like one or the other, it's always this combination of both, right? Like if we look at skill acquisition in general, and leadership is a skill, management is a skill, making decisions is a skill. These are all skills that we don't have them or not have them. We all have them. They just sit somewhere between being not very effective and highly effective, right? So we all sit somewhere here, and the goal is always to move more towards the highly effective end. I think when we look at business, no matter how many shitty situations you put yourself in, and how many times you kind of win, fail, or otherwise, that's not actually going to reinforce efficient decision making, right? It's the reflection, it's the consideration, it's the digestion of the feedback that you get, right? If you're in a boxing match and you constantly go one way and get hit the same way every time, you can get hit 10 times, 100 or 1,000, unless you take that as feedback and want to reflect and do it. So you're going to keep getting knocked in the head, right? And so business is very similar. I mean, now since having exited one of the organizations I founded, Sweat, and I've gone into quite a large amount of like advisory work with founders and in a mentoring or coaching capacity, it is fascinating to me how many people learn the same lesson many times. And that's an ironic statement in itself, because if you learn it once, you really shouldn't be repeatedly learning it, right? But it's a really interesting thing to observe, from an arm's length perspective, right? That in that case, people's emotions and ego are blocking them from learning, right? So yes, you have to have the intellectual component, read how to play golf or watch how to play golf, then go try play some golf, then reflect on the feedback that you're getting from the sport itself, your body, the results, people watching you, whatever, digest the feedback. It's just data, right? And again, that sounds a little mechanical, and people sometimes find those sorts of like words confronting. It's like every day that you're at work, you win, lose, or otherwise. Losing is a strong word, so maybe it's win, learn, or otherwise. That's all just feedback. If you don't want to accept and digest the feedback, well, it doesn't matter how much you play the sport.
Agreed.
Right. So it's a combination of do we intellectually learn? Do we experientially learn, if you want to think of it this way? But then, very importantly, like the learning is still predicated upon receiving and ingesting and integrating feedback and new information, right? Which unfortunately a lot of people don't do because they get emotionally blocked. They're afraid, or they're egotistical, or whatever, which we all have to a degree. But again, one of my favorite kind of perspectives or quotes, if you will, and I very often ask this to people that I work with. I say to them, I'm like, do you want to be right or do you want to win? Right? And you can change that to a variety of different contexts. If someone's doing a deal, it's like to exit deal, it's like, well, do you want to be the smart person in the room or you want to be rich? Like what are the kind of polar extremes here that we want to go at? And the one that presents itself to founders very often is, well, like, do you want to be comfortable or do you want to progress? Because the two very, very rarely exist together. And leadership and management is a great example. It's like it's really uncomfortable to digest the feedback if someone says to you, you're not good at management, or that didn't really work for me, or it's not really effective, or whatever it might be. That's quite hard to digest. And people, as human beings, we always want to kind of autonomously move towards the path of least resistance. And the path of least resistance in many of these environments is, well, avoid the feedback, avoid the data, hide. It's kind of head in the sand type mentality. And normally the people that are hyper successful do that less. Not always, but normally, right? And so if that's a principle and kind of an anecdote that we believe to be true, it's like, well, then put your head in the sand less if you want to have more success.
Well, do you think that you talked about sport within that scenario? I, as a junior, played, in the elite sport world with cricket and football, and for me, the lessons learned in that world, and I've spoken to a lot of entrepreneurs and successful business people, as you'd appreciate, and likewise, I think you have too. In sport, like let's just use football as an example, or cricket, whatever it is. In football, it's constant feedback, right? Like you mark the ball, if your hands aren't in the right position, the ball goes through your hands.
Yeah.
As you kick the ball, if it's not dropped on your foot properly, it's constant instant feedback. Then, not to mention that the runner will come out and provide you feedback from the coach. You get off the bench and the coach is standing there yelling at you, and he or she giving you feedback. And so it's this desire. I've kind of grown up with this desire for instant feedback, and so I think for me it's really helped me shape and move and understand and become a little bit more emotionally regulated when it comes to receiving feedback. Do you think that that in its own right is something, as you see leaders and business owners as they go through their career, the people who are putting their head in the sand, so to speak, are they the ones that haven't had the opportunity to learn how to receive feedback through their life?
Yeah, maybe. This is kind of back to first principles of like nature versus nurture, right? You're kind of born that way. Do you become that way based on the environment you're in? And I mean, I'm probably not educated enough to have that degree about psych theory.
I think
but I agree with your point though. Like I think that a lot of this, what we might call openness, to kind of just life in general, a lot of that does come from the way that we're brought up. But again, that's that in a concept in itself is almost quite simplistic. It's like there's multiple reasons for why you're open. You might be open because that was the culture of your family. You might be open because, and even if it's completely anti the culture of your family, you might have a high degree of openness because your desire to win is so much higher than your fear of anything else, right? Or maybe your fear of losing is the inverse. So there's a lot of different.
The want and need to be different, and
there's a lot of variables, and even in this predicament itself, there's a lot of nuance here, because there's a difference to being open to feedback versus seeking feedback, right? So someone who is open to feedback is reactive, so that they do something, they have proximity to data, either someone brings it to them or for whatever reason they get access to it, right? Which is very different, to kind of maybe another level or another approach, which is, well, yes, I have proximity to feedback, but what feedback am I not getting? Because in business, having success in business is it's multifactorial, right? It's not like a lot of people want to simplify it to be super smart or work super hard or right place, right time, or whatever it is, right? And it's algorithmic, right? And when we look at this sort of stuff, people want to simplify it down to that. One of the categories that is almost always missed is people's desire to become aware of things they are not aware of, right? So if we break our knowledge down into, we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, right? So things that we know exist and those things that we also have high knowledge about. Then there's things that we also know that exist, but we don't really have a lot of knowledge about. For most people, that's things like quantum physics, right? But then there's also things which we don't. Not only do we not have knowledge about, we're not actually even aware they exist. Right. And from a feedback perspective,
you don't know what you don't know, right?
You don't know what you don't know, and so a lot of people will only receive the feedback that is able to come to them from the people that they are around and that they reactively receive. So for example, in my journey, I didn't know what I didn't know about business. So I spent 6 months of the year for like 5 years in America just talking to highly successful people, listening and taking notes and being like, well, what are you focusing on that I've never heard of before?
Yeah.
And so some really practical examples of this were, well, early on, I didn't even know what ROAS was for advertising. I'd never even heard of it.
Do you think in your point there of, because there's the old saying is you are the average of the 5 people that your wage is the average of the 5 people that you surround yourself with, and that goes to your exact point of you're limited by their thinking.
Yeah.
Do you think that? And then I've been told recently that I have too many people I listen to. Do you think that's a problem?
I think all of it's folly. I think having too many and then the sum of 5, et cetera, I think all of that's a bit folly. I think it's that. I think all of that is just another beautiful way to avoid out accountability.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Because if you want to be really blunt about it, it's like, well, whether it's the 5 people around you or the 500 people around you or whatever, talk to who you need to get where you need to go. Like it's no different to before. Do what must be done. Don't do what you want to do. Do what must be done. Don't hang out with who you want to hang out with. Hang out with the people who have the highest probability of getting you where you want to go. And even in that case, there is only an assistance. Like it doesn't, like you could go and talk to, hang out with Warren Buffett 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 months if you wanted to. There's no correlation between that and being a good investor. Like if anything, that's a minute component. How many people have read every one of Warren Buffett's books? I mean, I've read most of his minutes for 30 years. Does that make me a good investor? Absolutely not. I'm still a learner. As far as I'm concerned, I'm a rookie investor. I'm a decent business person, but I'm a rookie investor. It's like a lot of people want to simplify, these things and boil them down to these things. I mean, I'd say something that's probably more accurate is, you will be anchored to the lowest quality of person that you spend regular time with.
Yeah, okay.
Because being that's sort of like hang around Michael Jordan won't make you good at basketball, but hanging around someone who is incredibly negative and toxic all the time will have a negative influence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, like negatives are far more likely to have a variable influence on you than a positive. Correct. Because the positive is nice to look at, but it requires effort and work. The negative requires less effort and less work.
This is lame game.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to just jump around here. Were you this knowledgeable earlier in your career? Like as I'm listening, because I'm listening here now, and I'm just going, oh my god, I'm never going to make it as a CEO with someone like you out in the world. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm comparing myself to you now, which is the root of all evil. But where did this knowledge come from? How did you learn and develop yourself to get to where you are now? That you're talking so many truths and have so many different thoughts and. I mean, you mentioned before feedback. You often talk about habits and building the right habits within your own life, but this ability to go back and look and digest and understand and evaluate is something that I'm feeling as you talk. Where did all that? Tell us how you learn. I'm really interested in how you learn things and how you move forward, and you use the word progress. How do you continually progress yourself?
Yeah. So I hate, and hate is a very strong word, and I'm using it very deliberately. I hate the idea that there is cheat codes to success or hacks or this or that or the other. Like it goes so hard against my values, right?
Sort of the get rich quick scheme sort of thing. Yeah.
All of that. Yeah. It I shouldn't let it, but it hurts me, right? But
did you ever sell any of it? Like get fit fast sort of thing?
No, never ever. No. I was completely opposite. I was anti it. But no, the one thing, like one really solid cut through thought with all of this stuff, and to do this is free of charge, right? It will cost you $0. You don't need to learn it or study it. It's zero. It's free, right? And 99.99999% of the world will never do it, right? And it is seek the truth, right? And to add, some explanation to that, right? Most people seek knowledge. And the issue with that is that not all knowledge or information is true. And so when we seek truth, we build the skill set that is to form our own opinion, which requires digesting multiple sources of information or data, going through our own problem solving and rationalization process, and then arriving at a conclusion, right? What most people are doing when they believe that they are, studying, so let's say they read a book or they listen to a podcast or whatever, they're not seeking truth. They're seeking a solution. They're seeking a quick fix.
Or an opinion, right?
Yeah, so out of all of the, and this is a very general term, let's call it, out of all the business media that is available, podcasts, blogs, published books, magazines, whatever, almost exclusively, like 90% of it, potentially even more, is either A, outright stories, or B is a case study of a story, right? And now, from a neurological perspective, like that's great for knowledge retention because stories are very often much easier to retain.
Correct.
But like that's like you're not even skimming the surface of the information that you actually would be able to learn. Like, so if you spent the same units of time, so a great example I give to a lot of people I work with, they're like, oh, well, how do I get good at business management? I'm like, go read Peter Drucker. And they're like, who's that? And I'm like, exactly. Like that's the guy who invented business management pretty much, right? He's the father of management. Yeah. And people are like, oh, okay, no worries. They go and buy his books, whatever they buy. And then a week or two later they come back and they go, oh man, that's hard to read. I'm like, well, you said you wanted to be good at management. Yeah. And the example is no different to a person that says, oh, hey man, like I want to lose 10 kilos. Like eat less shit food. Yeah. Go to the gym.
Pretty simple.
And they're like, yep, no worries. 2 weeks later, they're like, oh man, that's hard. I'm like, well, like welcome to reality, man. Like most stuff is hard, and so this whole notion of like seeking the truth is frankly almost anti everything that we are taught our whole lives. So if you think about the traditional education system, like it would explode if you went in and they said, oh, write a paper on this. And then you said, oh, well, I actually found out that all that's wrong. Like it would explode. Yeah. It wouldn't work. We're taught to, digest and regurgitate. We're not taught to digest or ingest, analyze, critique and form an opinion. Far less of the education system experience for most people, again, in English-speaking Western society, is considerate of that. And as a result of that, this notion of seeking truth is not only A, very hard for most people, but B, it's an absolutely massive superpower. And it's free. It costs you nothing. And so to come back to your point of like, oh, well, did I always have knowledge and whatever, like I still wouldn't consider myself a very knowledgeable person because I respect that there's a lot more to learn. But in the context of business, which I probably know more about than most other things that I have experienced in my life, I feel that I'm more entered than just shallow. Yeah. I would suggest it really comes down to seek truth. Like most of the business management books or stories or whatever don't really provide you the tools to do it because it's not really about truth. It's about, well, this is what worked in this situation. But what worked in this situation is not a reflection of what will work the majority or all the time. The truth is what will generally work. It's not what, this management process worked in Facebook where we had to recruit 20,000 people in 4 years. Yeah. Yeah, and we went from being nothing to a several $100 billion company in 15 years. Well, how the hell often does that happen? Yeah. Almost never.
No point listening to that story.
No, so it's not that it's fully useless, but it's more useful for motivation and inspiration than it is for education. Yeah. My professional opinion, right? Not a fact, but if you really want to learn stuff, like we'll go read books that are about the theory because that's where the information is. Like as silly as it sounds, you don't go and watch the documentary about Michael Jordan's career to get good at basketball. No. So why would you go and read the documentary about Facebook or Netflix to get good at business? Yeah. Like if there was ever an irrational approach to education, it's that.
You're right. I mean, people are naturally drawn to stories
because it's entertainment.
It's entertainment.
Yeah. Like Michael Jordan's story about The Last Dance, which is a phenomenal documentary. Yeah. I loved it and was very entertained by it. Same, but I wouldn't claim that after watching that I'm any better at basketball. Frankly, I'm terrible. No. Right? I've barely ever played in my life. I wouldn't want to. My partner Rachel was significantly better at shooting hoops than I am, which is an interesting experience.
You're talking to someone who comes from a basketball family, so my children play. But let's go back to seeking truth. I mean, Drucker's Managing Oneself was a book that absolutely changed my life. But I remember reading it at the time. And think it's a small book, very easy. It's Harvard review, right? Yep. And I remember reading it and going, I actually don't know how to apply this. I don't. So I think the jump to Drucker was too great at where I was at that particular time. So I actually started off on listening to or reading other books, probably Who Moved My Cheese was one of those first ones, which is really basic. Spencer Johnson's book of just how are you reacting to a change in your life, right?
Yeah.
And it's so simple. And that's kind of how I structured my learning and growth through was start off with books that you can actually pick up, and it's probably going to get you inspired and reading and maybe that is the storytelling aspect of it.
Yep.
And then you move your way up the ranks, and then you get into the druckers where you go.
It helps to contextualize the information, right? And this is a thing as well, right? Coming back to the portion earlier where we were talking about skill acquisition, right? Reading the Drucker book is the intellectual component, right? Attempting to implement it and failing for a very long time is the experiential part, right? And so whether it's Drucker or another author, Mintzberg or I don't know, whoever you want, Jim Collins is not, I wouldn't say is like directly management academia. It's kind of theoretical, conceptual, but even the Porter books on market analysis and all that sort of stuff. They're, my opinion, they're always and for a very long time probably going to be the best books to understand first principles of concepts. But you still have to try it and fail it, which is where this kind of next component of education, which is the idea of like getting mentors, and I deliberately use the word mentor as opposed to kind of coach or advisor, in the sense that you study the stuff to gain the intellectual knowledge, you try to implement it and you fail and learn, and then you should be sharing those learnings and receiving learnings from someone who's been there and done very specifically what it is that you want to do.
Yeah.
So, and this is probably a nuance to the whole seeking truth thing, right? People apply general learning methods to get specific knowledge, and that's failed.
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to go learn how to be like a really, really, really good people manager, to be a great leader and to build a great business, you might go, oh, I'm going to talk to these people who built great businesses. There's no correlation between making a lot of money and being a great leader. Almost none. In fact, as a matter of fact, there is a lot of terrible leaders who are worth billions of dollars.
Correct.
Right? Depending on the way that you score terrible.
Well, that's the part that I hate, which is the terrible leader making billions.
Well, and this is an interesting topic in itself, right? Like, how would you define good leadership, right? It
depends on the person who's receiving it.
Well, maybe, right? Because a lot of people would say, oh, well, as a leader, you have to be liked. It's like, well, is that true? Well, that's a very generic response to a specific problem, right? I don't, have a perfectly articulate answer, but, conceptually, or categorically, a good leader is someone who gets results. They have to get results, right? Results are a today thing, right? A good leader also has to be someone who is not going to run the business off a cliff. So they have to be setting up the business for future results. And so if you looked at it that, simplistically, it's okay, well, more often than not, you can get results today by being an arsehole if you want to. But eventually, being an arsehole won't get you, where you want to be in the long term, which then comes back to, oh, well, you must need to be liked. It's like, well, but you don't need to be liked to get results, right? So you have to be respected. You need to be able to engage people. Being engaged, if people are engaging with you, they don't have to love you, right? And so again, this is another, this is a topic in general, is sort of where people are trying to apply very generalized terminology or definitions or truths, to a very general approach to a very, very specific problem, right? Don't get entertainment content to learn theory in the same way, you can't make a generic phrase about leadership and leadership is X, Y, Z, when it's a very specific contextual topic that needs to be explored, basically, right? And this, what's the common theme in all of these things? Why do we seek general over specific? Why do we seek entertainment over theory? Well, because it's more comfortable. It's the path of least resistance. It's easier to have a low fidelity view because there's less accountability. It's easier to watch entertainment and consume that content than it is to read theory, because this requires focus. That doesn't. Focus requires intellectual effort, right? Like watching a entertainment, doco or whatever doesn't. You can binge it.
Exactly.
Right? So there's a really common theme, and a lot of people kind of view this as borderline stoic, right? If you will, or a part of that philosophy. It's, do the things that must be done, not what you want to do, or do the hard thing, lean into discomfort. There's there's hundreds and thousands of iterations of this, but
Meditation is one of my favorite books. Marcus Aurelius.
Aurelius one. And again, and that's one of his. I can't remember which one it is, but it's one of his things. It's basically all of these concepts around, well, do the things that need to be done, do the right thing, do the moral thing. And that all sounds like super easy. Everyone's like, yeah, I'll do that. And it's like, well, what's moral?
Mm.
And they couldn't tell you because they want to apply a generalized approach because it allows buffer room for them to fail, but then kind of hide that. But I thought this is what moral was, or I thought this is what study was, or whatever it is. But really, most of us, and this is one of the overarching things about self-discipline learning. Most of us know what the right thing is to do.
Mm. Mm.
We just pretend that we don't, or we're afraid to acknowledge that we do, because when we ultimately don't do it, well then we are bad. We perceive ourselves as bad, which is this whole self-judgment, fear thing again.
Did you want to be liked when you were a CEO?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of my. I would suggest it was probably one of the most painful experience of my career. In general, was trying to work with other people at the beginning of the journey, because my philosophy of I wouldn't have even called it management or leadership. I probably didn't even know the words at that point. It would have been, I want people to be happy. Which, and I didn't figure this out for many years. But that actually came from a point of me wanting to be, valued and liked on a personal level more than I really actually cared about the professional relationship. I was afraid that I wasn't a nice person. More so than it had anything to do with management and leadership, which is, again, this whole introspection and feedback collection thing is really important, right? Because as we seek truth, which is what I did later, you realize that, being liked is not the single KPI of leadership and management. Again, it's a multifactorial problem.
So where did you pay your attention on then as a CEO that built a $400 million business?
Yeah, so a combination of things. So, first thing, any executive, but especially someone in the CEO role or an equivalent role, because some people might call it a managing director or a general
leadership role of a business,
or whatever, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Ultimately, the considerations are normally there's a variety, but normally you could probably break them down into got to have a strategy. Strategy is normally kind of consistent of what are you trying to achieve? What work needs to be done to achieve that? What resources need to be done to do the work? And why? Right? So as an executive, you need to be able to understand those things. Then if you go a layer deeper, if the resources is what deliver the work and the work is what delivers the outcomes, you've got to make the resources work. Resources are normally money, time, people. Money and time are pretty simplistic.
Yep.
Right? People's not. So then you have to find a way to work with people. How does that happen? Well, you have to build relationships, which I sucked at for a really, really, really long time.
In what regard?
So going back to something we said earlier around that there's kind of the commercial, logical, practical decisions, and then there's people's emotions, right? I struggled to understand, and some people might call this neurodivergent, right? But I struggled to understand that if there's a logical option, like a very logical decision, we should clearly do A, B, C, because to not do it would be bad. Or that everybody would just agree to that because it was the most obvious and practical decision. It didn't occur to me for probably 3 or 4 years that not everyone thinks that way, which, is quite comical, right?
Just don't look at Paula right now.
Yeah. So it's and that's that sounds like, when I had this realization, I was like, oh my God, I'm like, for someone who I think has at least, moderate intelligence, I was like, the fact that I had never ever come to that conclusion, I was embarrassed that I had never ever figured that out.
Yeah. Because money was one of your drivers and it might not be others.
Well,
right?
yeah, I was just like, if the goal is money and business performance business performance requires these things, well, we should just do that.
Yeah. And your agenda is to scale and scale quickly, and their agenda is to enjoy their job, right?
Yeah. It's to be engaged. It's to contribute. It's to develop. It's to feel empowered and have autonomy. There's a variety of these sort of engagement factors. I'm sure you're across it all, right? And so from that perspective, for me, in the leadership role, I had no problem intellectually understanding things or commercially rationalizing things. It was always trying to get the team members to get on the same page, which then I struggled with because I was like, I want you to like me, but in order for me to get done what I need to get done, I have to be firm. And so it was this real big struggle, which eventually I simplified this into the whole firm but fair management theory, right? It's do what needs to be done and do it firmly, but do it really fairly and respectfully, which eventually leads you to a conclusion where, then eventually you do that, but you still get some pretty shitty negative feedback. And then that creates a bit of inner turmoil because you're like, oh, well, I'm being firm, but I'm definitely being fair. why is this not working? And then you eventually come to a further nuanced conclusion, which is that, well, no matter how good your leadership and management is, you will never win with everyone. Right. And so the acceptance of that and a few other things.
You're not always going to be liked.
Yeah, correct. You won't always be liked. You won't always, and you won't always win. You know, everyone in business knows that you will not always win. Right. And if anything, winning all the time actually is very unfortunate for the person experiencing it.
Poor feedback.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I commonly refer to this as the Midas bias.
Yeah.
Right. You know, people, they win all the time. They think anything they touch will turn to gold. So they start all these businesses and do all this stuff, and then eventually, bang, yeah, it doesn't work.
It's really painful.
Yeah. But yeah, coming back to the management thing, like easily the most painful experience for me was going through that learning journey of realizing, okay, well, you're not going to be liked by everybody. You still have to find a way to get results ultimately. You know, so, and that's for most people, and definitely me, because I at this point in my life, you know, I hadn't even discovered that I had insecurity about like self-worth issues and self-esteem. I had no idea that I didn't even know that I had those problems. I was like, I'm confident. Yeah, I'm good. But, you know, when you're like 21 years old running a business like that, you're not really considering all this other stuff. You know, you're effectively, in many regards, and most of us at that age are almost exclusively blind to the existence of any of this other stuff, either intentionally or otherwise.
I reckon that's a human nature design there, right? So it sounds to me that you went through a bit of pain through your learning. What would your people say about you?
Depends on which ones you talk to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And which ones do you care about?
Well, yeah, I think like from a leadership and management perspective, you should care about everyone.
Yeah.
Right.
No doubt. But
yeah, I think the ones that would be most like, as in the feed, if a whole bunch of people were to give me feedback, the ones that I would care about most would be the ones that were actually, you know, in all of the rooms with me, in all the decisions, in all the debates.
So had the context.
Yeah, they had all of the context. But in saying that, you know, and something that I developed much more towards the end of my, you know, journey was that I think like leading from a position of compassion and empathy for people, but making decisions commercially is kind of that's the ultimate duo, right? And so yeah, I cared very much about you know, how everyone felt, and there's something I prided myself on in my time at Sweat. You know, for most of the journey, I could walk into any part of our building and know everyone, know all their names, know what work they were doing, and know all that, and that was quite important to me.
Did you need to know about their personal lives?
No, I didn't need to.
No.
But to me, like, you know, I thought like, what, you know, that's an incredibly good experience. You know, if the person who owns a company, runs a company, who you've never even been in a meeting with, you know, can, you know, at your quarterly staff party, can catch up and say, oh, how's your kid's name, Brad? Yeah, like that sort of stuff. Like, to me, was pretty important. And, you know, ultimately the goal is to coming back to, you know, trying to lead from a position of compassion and empathy. Like, people want to know that you understand them. People want to know that you actually give a shit. Yeah. Right. But yeah, if you spoke with you know, some of my more senior employees, the ones that I worked, you know, in closer proximity with, yeah, I think the headlines would probably be, I'm pretty direct. That can very often be interpreted as blunt. But I think they would probably also say that I'm pretty fair and practical, and that more often than not, I'm calm. I definitely have some very, we used to have an internal joke that I would have acute negative emotional responses to things. It became a joke because it'd be like, bloop, bloop, and then gone. But yeah, I think people would say that, you know, more often than not, I'm pretty centered and calm.
How did you deal with being firm? Like, you're running your business, right? You started this business ultimately because it was 50% ownership, wasn't it? Yeah, and was there a board in place?
No boards, no mentors, no advisors. No.
So ultimately, every dollar you make goes to your pocket in a sense. How did you navigate through the waters of, I need to push and I want to earn revenue, whilst knowing that potentially in the background people are like, well, you're pushing us because you want more dollar in your pocket, right? Like, how did you navigate that world? And again, this comes back to the being like thing, but I'm interested in your thoughts there.
Oh, I think almost the answer has nothing to do with the question, in the sense it's like, well, align people around a goal. Yeah,
okay.
So like you know, one of the things that I think that we did, and I use the word we very deliberately because I think it would be arrogant and to state a falsehood that it was me when it wasn't. Yes, I might have been the CEO, but really I only contributed a very small portion of the greatness that we actually made, you know, during my time at Sweat.
The number one role of a CEO is to assemble the team.
Yeah, so that they can win.
Correct.
Right. I mean, going back to the Drucker thing, right? All results in business are generated by people, not me, the people. So, but like I think aligning people around a single thing was something that we did very well. We had people who wanted to join our business just because they wanted to come and contribute to female fitness.
Yeah.
Because we'd gotten so effective in recruitment marketing and culture and whatnot that there were so many people that really wanted to contribute to that. And then we had so many people that wanted to contribute to cool growing technology, and so we made that known. And when they came in, we tried to allow them to do that. And again, depending on who you talk to at what point in time in the company journey, everyone will have different opinions, of course. But I truly think that we did a really good job of that. And we, you couldn't go more than about half a day without having someone kind of scream at you our purpose, our vision, our values. Like, through the recruitment process, they're in our position descriptions, right? Like through your onboarding documents, they're in every single onboarding doc. Your onboarding presentation, they're in your onboarding presentation. All the learning material, they're in your learning material. Every company strategy document, they're in there. Every single town hall that we have, they're in there. Every MBR, they're in there. Like you couldn't escape, what we were trying to create, and what we put around. And I think people were highly aligned to that. And then on a more kind of like practical, less qualitative basis, over time we implemented incredibly strong and well-structured management frameworks. Most of the results in our organization and most of the management decisions were driven by our monthly business review, which is just a part of a broader management system that a lot of organizations used. And we always made that very much about like the team or multiple teams' performance. It wasn't so much about individual.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, many times we try to avoid that. But I think a great example of trying to like lead in a way that is firm but fair, and that whole compassion and empathy mindset. A great example. I'd worked with this particular individual who was in quite a senior role, and they had been brought on to set up a new function for us. And they were being paid about $250,000 a year, which in Australian money is
pretty good.
Top 1% of salaries probably. Great individual, really charismatic. On a personal level, loved spending time with this person. We got along, in my opinion, quite well. And over sort of 9 or 12 months, they generated 0 business results. Like literally 0, like in this new function, like not we couldn't attribute or measure it, like hard 0, right? And for the last sort of 3 or 4 months, like this particular person has effectively been on a performance improvement plan. We'd gone through all that sort of stuff, and obviously eventually got to the point where I had to have the conversation and say, well, you're out. And so to contextualize, this person's, I think, had recently been married, had a couple of young boys. They just bought a new house, a massive mortgage, and they just, sign up to put their kids in private school.
It's painful, yeah.
So I'm sitting down having a conversation with this person, literally being like, I'm about to bring your life temporarily to a halt.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people would say like, oh, well, in that context, like you're an asshole, or that's rude, or that's mean, or whatever. On a practical basis, coming back to that separation of emotions and commerciality, it's like, well, every decision in business is an investment decision. The decision to recruit someone as an investment, you're investing in the results that they will get you. Like it's super. You buy petrol so you can drive your car. Like it's super practical, right? So in a scenario where the results are not being generated, well, then the investment is no longer viable. So in people management, we normally say, well, we put them on performance plans to try to help them become viable. And if they can't, well, then they need to go. So that's the practical component of the decision-making process, right? From a compassion and empathy perspective, you could say nothing and then get to the end of the period and go snip, see ya. Or you could get a part way through and you could put them on a performance plan and learn about their life and understand why they're not performing and this and that and the other, and see if is it an attitude issue or is it a competency issue. And then you might try to work with them really closely for a couple of months, and if they can't succeed, then you might decide to snip and let them go, or you might decide to say, hey, look, this is not going to work. That's really sad for me, and I understand it's probably sad for you too. I really want to find a way where we can kind of give you a smooth landing here on the way out of the business. So, I was thinking that maybe you could have a think about what that transition might look like for you, because we value you as an individual and as an employee to our business, regardless of whether or not we've been able to achieve all the results we wanted. And so for that person receiving that conversation, that's a hell of a lot nicer than, hey, you didn't hit your KPIs there.
tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, and so culturally, and again, something that we tried to do, we actually tried to, like exiting employees was something that we put a lot of effort into because we wanted them to leave and positively talk about the business. Yeah, which is, again, was quite counterintuitive. Most businesses are just worried about, oh, snip, see you were a dud.
Yeah.
But if you're leading from a position of compassion and empathy, well, you'll ask yourself that question. If this person is going to leave the business, what should I do as a leader and manager? And as a company, what should we do for them? And what supports should we provide? So that when they do leave and they talk about their experience here, even though they got fired, what do we have to do to increase the probability that they say positive things about us?
They got fired gracefully. Yeah. Did you come up with this approach? I mean, was this something that you as a team, you all decided? What role did you play as the CE in the culture of the business? Because you surround yourself with a great team. We all know Sarah, right? Like, a lot of people listening in would know Sarah. She's fantastic. She was your head of people and culture.
Yeah.
Not the head of, not the culture sits with people and culture. Culture is everyone's job.
Yeah.
What did you do as the CEO to really drum in, this is the culture that we're working for? How did you lead by example?
Look, I think to state it, and this will be kind of very anticlimactic, but to state it in the most honest and kind of factually true manner, the only thing that I did was have an openness to it. So like it would be false for me to say, hey, I was, I was a epic leader or epic manager because I was terrible for the majority of the journey. And when I say terrible, it's not that I didn't try. It's just that the learning curve is just so big. I would say that I got pretty good, towards the end. But I was just incredibly lucky to be able to get access to and eventually become surrounded by people that were just absolutely incredibly good at their jobs. We had obviously, Sarah was very good. My COO, Adam, who ended up, becoming CEO, he succeeded me when I left. Yeah. I consider myself blessed to have been able to work with him. The amount that I learned off of him is just absolutely, it's hard to quantify. We had a variety of other great people in the business, which and they all had different kind of strengths and weaknesses, but specifically in the lens of people and culture and leadership and management, we had a variety of them that were just absolutely outstanding at their jobs, like just absolutely outstanding. And this is, people always talk about the value of people in a business, et cetera, but it's a hard thing for them to understand because not only have most people never seen great, they've almost never even seen good. And I mean that in a respectful way in the sense that, even in professional services, right, out of every 100 accountants, how many of them are any good? Maybe 15. Out of those 15, how many of them are great? Maybe 3. So that means that the remaining 85 are moderate or worse. And that's not being blunt or an opinion, that's just the law of numbers. In any given discipline, most of the people are going to be pretty terrible. So for most organizations, most of the people they recruit will actually be not high performers. It's your job to try to make them become that, but the base level that they start with is not great. And so for those individuals, and I was one of them, who is able to find great people, and we can call that luck, fortune, and maybe a little bit of skill, it is truly game changing to the level of success you have. Because a lot of people, and especially in small businesses, go, fuck, 150K for a salary. Maybe I'll get a mid-level person for 100.
Yeah.
No. It's like, man, that $50,000 that you just saved cost you $5 million. Like and the maths is literally something like that. I mean, I remember recruiting for my first executive, and I was like, oh my God, a salary like over 150 grand. It was like 300 or something at the time. And I was like, that's just eye-watering. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I don't think I recruited someone worth over $80,000 for the first 3 years. We're doing like $25 million. Because I didn't understand the spectrum of competence and the scope of salary range, right? But that's not to say that more money means better, because there's definitely that relationship is not true. But to get really high level of competency, especially in leadership and management, you normally will need to pay more money. Yeah.
Well, those people know their worth, don't they? Right. Yes. And they're not going to accept the 80 grand, or are they? So, in amongst all this, you are a lover of metrics as well. What were some of your key focuses on as a leader of this business, and what was a non-negotiable for you?
Yeah. So maybe just when we look at like metrics and data in business, I'd probably maybe go like up one level macro and basically say that I think so. We use and collect information or metrics or whatever to kind of make decisions, right? But ultimately, all of those decisions that you make or any decision made in any business is it has a context, right? And the context in any business is ultimately the business model, right? So, to your question, it's like, oh, what did I look at and what did I use? It's like, well, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, what actually are the right metrics for this particular business model that actually make sense?
It's going to move the dial.
Yeah, well, what do we care about? Yeah, and so most people will, and again, even people who make lots of money, right? Most people will oversimplify it. You go, oh, I'm an e-com, and they go, oh yeah, awesome, bro. ROAS, traffic, conversion rate, AOV, LTV, and that's some metrics, and they're to it. They have some utility, but they're definitely not all of it. You look at subscription, which is what we were for the large part, and they go, oh, bro, yeah, acquisition, retention rate, CAC, done. But that's like that again. It's very low fidelity.
Yeah,
it's not that. And I always kind of use this phrase when talking about metrics and data and all this sort of stuff, is that the metrics or lenses that you choose to look through ultimately show you a part of a particular picture. So, like for example, if you want to look at financial performance, well, you could probably look as simple as revenue, COGS, OPEX, EBITDA, and if you trended that over time, you get a decent picture of a business's financial performance.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but where is the money going? So then you go layers down again, and layers down again, and layers down again. So. My specificity matters. If you have a specific goal, it's no different to learning things. If you want to learn specific things, you have to ask specific questions and read specific content. If you want to get specific insights in business, you have to look at specific metrics in specific context to get specific insight, right? So for most of my role, I really looked at this in two ways. I'm like, I want to get what I kind of call wet finger in the air, like how are we going, right? Yeah, and we had a pretty generic scorecard dashboard that we looked at that had a small collection of metrics, which we called MTM, which stood for metrics that matter. And then there's kind of a hard line, and underneath that, then there was a whole bunch of more tactical drivers, of those things that we would use to learn, because we wouldn't really use these metrics to learn other than are we winning or losing at a macro level. We would then use this stuff here to figure out, well, why are we winning or losing? Yeah. Right. And a lot of people kind of blend them, and that's where they get stuck, and or they don't measure them properly, right? So yeah, for me, like, the subscription model, sure, largely is, like, what's your recurring revenue? What's the split of that? What are your COGS and OPEX? What's the EBITDA, if you have EBITDA, and what are the trend of those ratios over time? But, I mentioned earlier, we had a very sophisticated monthly business review, which we broke down functionally, and each function in the business had a scorecard. So each owner, normally a head of or a chief of some set of functions, they would have their own scorecard. So the same way I looked at this level, then they would have their level. Then they would have team and channel owners that would have their level. So this is that cascading business management framework again, if you will. But yeah, like, we could talk about the data for a long time. So
data is a specific conversation that not everyone loves, but for me, it's one that I think Paula and I are actually exploring right now. So she's listening in intently.
Well,
but
your business is an interesting one, right? Again, like, how do you understand the business model of a professional services firm? We spoke broadly about it before.
Well, it's really interesting because earlier you actually said you should seek advice of those who have done it, right? And, the big businesses in the world that have done this are, the big four and the McKinseys and whatnot. But the people who built that from zero, they're not available to speak to.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's even using the phrase who's done it is low fidelity.
Yeah.
Right? It's because, well, who done what?
Yeah, correct.
So like, and again, so if you want to find the people who understand how businesses make money and generate revenue or whatever better than anyone else, we'll talk to people who do financial modeling. Yeah. Because their job is to financially articulate how the business generates money. And so, in services industries, everyone wants to pretend that they're different and complicated and this and that and the other. And ultimately, more often than not, it's people selling time, because most things are still time-based or rate-based as opposed to value-based. Yeah. And for that, well, therefore, you have X number of employees. The employees have a certain amount of billable hours. Normally, there's a range of minimum, neutral, and maximum stretch hours, whatever. You have a utilization rate of those hours. Yeah. Right? You have average billable rate. Right. There's some pass-through costs depending on the industry that the professional services firm is existing in, but they're really the key central metrics if you want to wet finger in the air.
Yeah, correct.
If you want to go more specific, it's like, well, per service or per team or per function, what's the billable rate, what's the utilization geographically, industry-wise, et cetera, et cetera. But
you still throw LTV in there and everything as well, and CAC and all the above. So it's just but having the not like you could go out into the world right now and from a tech point of view, you could get so much information on how to build and start a tech firm and online firm. But when you look at services, it's actually very limited information out there from what you can do to build a services-based company. And it's bloody difficult, right? Because you're actually selling skill sets, you're selling people, you're selling ideas, you're selling methodologies as opposed to a widget, right? Which is a bit different.
Correct, yeah. And again, with that, like trying to identify the appropriate individual to learn the specific thing from is interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, in Australia, we have a whole bunch of like great professional service entrepreneurs, there's a lot of great marketing agency people that are doing, $50 to $100 million a year aggregating agencies. And so when you look at professional services as a category, well, how do most of the businesses grow? Almost exclusively, all of the large organizations grow through acquisition. Almost exclusively. And the reason for that is to your point, because the challenges is, well, scaling people is hard, and acquiring clients is hard, especially in professional services, because the clients are sticky.
Yeah, correct.
They're very sticky. So if you can't poach a client, you can buy them, but then you have to buy the business. And then the notion of like buying professional service firms and growing them over the long term is a completely, talking about skill sets earlier, it's a completely different skill set, to running one.
Correct.
Yeah, and this is why far less people end up buying and aggregating than starting and running, because starting and running is one skill set that is, respectfully slightly easier to acquire because there's much more publicly available information. Than buying and aggregating them, over a period of years, because much higher risk, much harder to get information about, much more complicated.
All the above, absolutely. I'm interested in, like, I ask a lot of questions about family on the show because I have a young family, 2 young girls, absolutely in love with them. And one thing that I always grapple with, and especially over the case in point, the past 2 days, I've woken up when it's dark, I've gotten to work when it's dark, and I've gotten home when it's dark, and you know what I mean? So there's a level of sacrifice that goes into running a business, building it, scaling it, managing it, all the above, and then also spending quality time with family. How did you manage that concoction? How did you manage this world of, you got beautiful young daughter Anna, managing relationships while growing, with loved ones, whilst trying to realize on your visions in amongst that as well? Yeah,
I think at the end of the day, a lot of this really boils down to the quality of communication between people, right? And I also even mean that like the quality of communication with yourself. And what I mean by that is that most people live passively and unconsciously. And so what I mean by that is, so the experience, wake up in the dark, go to work in the dark, get home in the dark, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They see that's a negative stimulus or negative perception, right? And then they start from the position that this is bad, and it's a bad world, but it is what it is. That's normally the circle of thought. And there's never, or in very limited occasions, there's not necessarily well, hold on, let's put all that pause and step back and go, well, like, what do I actually want for my life? And what I mean by that is that a lot of people use an autonomous prioritization, hierarchy in their minds, and normally it prioritizes like things like survival and status and power more than it prioritizes things like sanity and love and affection and whatever, which arguably you actually need those to do these in some regard. And so what I mean by that is, most people have a work calendar, right? They have a work schedule and they go, okay, well, in any given month, I'm going to have, one monthly team meeting, one weekly sales meeting, whatever the company is, blah, 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 blah. And some people then even go so far as saying, oh, yeah, but then I'll do gym 3 times a week. And I'll book that in, right? Almost nothing ever makes it into the calendar. And then so people have this predicament. They're like, oh, well, I'm struggling to like balance these things. I'm like, no, you're not. I'm like, you're balancing the things you want to balance perfectly well. Work and maybe your health, and then occasionally a social thing. So it's not an issue actually balancing and making decisions, is that you're not actually starting with the whole picture. People are very often starting with a portion of the picture. And then a lot of people will argue back at that and go, oh, well, yeah, but if I include that, like one thing's got to sacrifice or this, that, the other, I'm like, well, yeah, but not normally in the way that they think. Because again, people's kind of myopic approach is, oh, well, I'll just work less hours, I'll make less money, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, that's a very general solution to a very specific problem.
Yeah.
We keep coming back to the recurring thing. It's like, well, I have a client of mine that I work with, runs a very, very, healthy business, and has multiple 7 figures in EBITDA. And they're like, oh, man, like my life is just hectic, blah, blah, blah. And then, kids, same scenario, all this sort of crap. And I'm like, oh, okay. And they're like, oh, but I love my work. I'm like, yep. Well, why don't you spend, 10 or 20% of the profit that you make a year recruiting a couple of really expensive executives who are really highly competent and see if they can free up 5 or 10 hours of your life a week? And that's a completely different mentality, because you just go, well, what's it worth?
Yeah, correct.
What's having a good family worth to you? You're like, do you want to be like, oh, I hit $2 million in EBITDA and have nothing else? I'm like, oh, I hit $1.7 million in EBITDA, but like I've got a great family. I've got great, so that's a more specific solution to a more specific problem, right?
Correct.
Yeah, and so like a lot of people, coming back to the mentality I mentioned earlier, that everything in business is an investment decision. Everything in your life is an investment decision. You invest in your relationship, you'll get a greater ROI.
Correct. Yeah.
If you don't invest in it, and you don't service it, if you will, and don't maintain it, and all these sorts of things, well, you'll get a lower ROI. Yeah, with your children, the relationship with your children, if you invest more resources, whatever those resources are, and however you choose to do them, more likely than not, you'll probably get a better ROI. But at work, people are exclusively thinking about financial ROI. They're not thinking about life ROI. Yeah, and that's a real big problem. I mean, like when we were, I'm trying to think, like going through the, kind of like last part of the deal, I was like living in a house by myself, effectively like part-time kind of like single dad, because we were doing 50-50 share with my daughter. And it's like, well, like what's it worth to me to still put her to bed every night? And that was worth a huge amount of money to me. So I was like, okay, well then I'll train during the day and I'll lose work hours.
Yep.
Because it's worth more to me to put her to bed every night and spend some time with her. Yeah, then I can pay someone $30-$40 an hour to put her to bed. Like, and that's not the right rule for everybody, right? Everyone needs to figure out their values.
But you would know this better than anyone, right? Especially in startup phase. And you said in those first 3 or 4 years, you didn't employ anyone on sort of 80 grand or whatever.
Yeah.
In those first 3 or 4 years, you're always 3 months away from going bankrupt. Like the cash flow is a pain.
Yeah.
How do you, the idea of and being able to just flick the switch and go, well, I'm just going to hire someone to do that, is one that most people would grapple with, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talk about lots of stuff here, but I think the headline here is like, how do we differentiate between objective and subjective risk?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah,
how do we?
So even if let's use, because the relevant example, let's use a services business, right? Services businesses normally don't grow linearly because the ability to deliver service is lumpy in the sense that you can't recruit 1/10 of an employee more often than not.
Correct.
Some companies do outsourcing or whatever, but
absolutely. No, you're right.
Okay, so mathematically there is an efficient and an inefficient way to do that, and that comes back to the level of understanding that you have about the quality of your business and the way that the economics work, right? So in that scenario there, if you're looking at growing, it's like there is a mathematical way to determine the level of objective risk, right? The reason that most people get afraid about making those decisions is because they perceive it as subjective, right? In essence that they can't calculate it or that it's out of their control, et cetera, right? So let's use an example where you're 3 months away from, you're running a business, but you've only got 3 months of cash flow, slim margins, right? And you bring someone in, you employ them at whatever salary, and then all of a sudden you start losing money, right? Well, objectively, the maximum risk is however many months of salary you keep them on for underperforming.
Well,
because if you get 3 months in and they haven't delivered any results, well, then you terminate the employment arrangement with them and you go back to having slim margins. Yeah. That is objectively the situation, right? People don't look at it that way. Why? Because ego. Oh, well, I'm afraid if I do that, that'll be hard. Or if I'm afraid I'll do that, I'll fail. It's like, but that's not objective. The objective is, well, what's the cost, what's return, end. And this is the discussion before. How do we perceive the situation with all its variables? How do we move our emotions to the side and then make a commercial decision, right? But again, most people either have not yet built the skill set and the tactile capability to do that, or alternatively, even if they can intellectually rationalize it, they can't emotionally achieve the outcome.
Yeah, I reckon the emotional part is the toughest part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it always comes back to what everyone else was. What are people going to say?
Mm-hmm.
If I bring on that person, then cash flow is a conversation that's always hot topic within, especially within small business.
Yep.
So if I employ someone, then everyone's going to, hang on, aren't you short of cash flow? But that's there to solve a problem. That's objective, all the above, right? So it's just this constant, the emotional part.
Lead with compassion and empathy. Well, so if I was in that position running a business now, I'm not, right? I'm running other businesses, not in this situation. But if I was in that situation, I'd be like, okay, cool, town hall. Hey guys, we have growth targets. We're struggling to hit them. I think we need another resource to do that. Really love your opinion and feedback. As you know, cash is tight, so I'm not 100% sure how this is going to go. So we're going to treat this as a learning opportunity.
Do people get scared if cash is tight?
Absolutely, they do.
Do the people? Does it sit only with the leadership team? Does the rest of the business?
Depends how much information you want to share to the company, right?
Would you share that information?
We shared everything.
It was complete open and transparent.
Like literally, other than perhaps giving them access to our legitimate chart of accounts, right? People had access to either static or dynamically updated metrics and data for pretty much everything in the business.
Because there's always this. We interview and we speak with a lot of CEOs, and some are like, "No, don't show any finance." Some are like, "Mate, open the books."
Yep. And again, that's a choice, right?
Correct.
And there's not, again, like with a lot of these things, and even a lot of the stuff we've spoken about today, it's not about right or wrong. Like even if just use the example like general versus specific solutions or subjective versus objective risk, you can think about these things and use them or not use them to make decisions however you like. It's not that one is right or wrong. It's that very often one is more useful or less useful, right? And in business, life as well, but in business, what's the name of the game? Well, make good quality decisions more often than you make bad ones for a really long time.
But you, like me, we're a young CEO, right? And I look, anyone that's in lot 14 over there doing these beautiful startup, fantastic tech startup, fintech, all the above, right?
Yep.
They're not sure if they're making the right decision. There, you come to a fork in a road, you go, shit, left or right? Which way do I go? I'm going to choose left.
Yep.
Is that the right decision? And you go in there.
This comes back to point one. They're afraid of accountability.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like you have to choose left or right.
You just circle back and go around the other. Yeah.
Because the worst choice is to passively make no choice.
Yeah.
So the biggest risk to most businesses, and especially early on, right, when they're still figuring all the basic junk out, right, the biggest risk is no decision. And the reason for that is because they don't have unlimited cash or time. A lot of people think it's like, I've got to sign this NDA. I don't want to share you anything. My idea is special, bespoke, rah. That's all crap.
Yeah,
all that's crap. And all that wastes time.
Yeah.
Right? Like the important thing is like, how am I determining progress and what am I even trying to progress towards?
Yeah.
But most people are not even clear on those two things. Why? Because that's bloody scary. You say, I'm building some super cool piece of tech. Okay, well, how are you objectively measuring if it does what you think it needs to do? And is what you think it needs to do even what the customer wants it to do? And if they want to do that, will they even pay for it? And if they will, how much will they pay? But like that's a really simple conversation. Most people will never ever get to it because they go, I'm building cool tech. And build it and they will come.
Well, they're emotionally attached to their tech. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. It's not an objective world. And again, every human behavior is a reflection of an emotional need. Yeah. Right. So emotions are very important. Very often they're fuel. They certainly were and still are for me in a variety of different ways. Right. But again, this comes back to let the emotions do their thing. Do not let them make all your decisions.
You seem very, very good at being able to do that. And this is a question I asked earlier in this conversation: is how do you do that? And we can go down that rabbit hole again, which I don't want to, but. For me, it's is there a brain type? Is there a personality type? Is there a behavior type? I'm connected to human beings, right? So therefore, and I'm not connected to process, right? My brain just doesn't work in a process type way. It works in a way in which is what's best for the human and what's actually logical for the human, right? Like that's kind of how it works. And so I make decisions on that. And sometimes those two worlds just clash because the logic stacks up, but what's best for the human doesn't actually make sense. So, did you think it's based on the type of person and their upbringing? And
there's a lot of variables here, right? But
absolutely,
if you, one of the biggest things that I learned about trying to improve decision making is if you're really having a tough time making a decision, write it all down.
Yeah. Okay.
So whether it's by hand or a computer or whatever, but write it all
just
down.
Get it all out, brain dump.
Right. So whatever it is, like I don't know, like you're trying to do I raise more money or do I not? Do I break up with my partner? Do I choose to pick up this new sport? Whatever it is, right? Because when you write it down and this shock horror, what does writing it down do? Well, it makes us accountable to our thoughts because they're real now, right? A lot of the time when people are trying to make decisions in their mind, on the fly, and ones that they, for whatever reason, find challenging, right? Doing it exclusively internally, right, is a wonderful way to avoid accountability. When you write it down, you are now accountable. It's like, well, shit, actually, I do think that, and and you start to get a bit of a reflection of reality. And a lot of the time with these things, an exercise I would do is I'd write it down, leave it for a day, not think about it, come back, review it again, see if I would change anything, leave it for another day, come back, and then I would make my decision. Because you get a bit of fresh perspective. And also when it's written down, you no longer need to think about it. Why? Because you go, oh, yep, I've already written all that down.
Because it's a physical object now.
Yeah. And so as by virtue of that, it's great for clearing your mind, firstly. But
that's why I bought this Remarkable, right?
Yeah.
It's for that exact reason.
Yeah. And so once they're written down, then you can go and you can review it. Yeah. You can review your thoughts the same way that you would review a piece of copywriting or review a contract or review financials. You can review it and analyze it. And you effectively then become almost a third person in your first person world.
Yeah, you become an advisor to your thoughts.
Yes.
I love that. We started this conversation asking about your daughter.
Yeah, we did.
So we've digressed a lot. Yeah. I do want to touch back on the family thing because for me, it seems like that the answer to the question is that you have to really understand your priorities. What are your priorities, and actually design your life with family included in it. Right? It's not one or the other. It is all the above. But you are in philosophy. You mentioned Stoicism before. Yeah, an area which I like to sort of delve into as well. I don't want to get into your life philosophy or what you think, from where the human race is going or anything like that. But I do really want to understand your thoughts as a father and what it means to bring in a human into this world and how you raise them and how you nurture and cultivate their mind.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's first and foremost, I think the biggest responsibility you'll ever have in your life is a child. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that, a lot of people, could potentially interpret that negatively. I don't mean that you've got to wipe their butt and take care of them and feed them and all this. No, I mean, I think that's, I perceive that as an opportunity. That's a blessing that we, get to take care of our children. But when I say it's the biggest responsibility in the sense that, your job in simple terms is to set them up to integrate well with society and succeed and live a healthy, happy life, right? And you might variably define those words, of course, but generally speaking, that's the goal. And then what you realize is that that's an incredibly scary process because you realize all the shit that you do wrong, that if you were totally perfectly in control of everything that you do, which you in essence are, but to a degree are not, you realize, oh shit, well actually no, I don't want to train that behavior to you. I don't want to train that behavior to you. And so, it becomes quite a intensely reflective process, obviously. But yeah, from my perspective, ultimately, how do you set them up for success and integration with society, right? And, there's a variety of those things. How do you teach them to take care of themselves? How do you teach them to independently make good decisions? How do you teach them to have good quality relationships? There's the list goes on, correct, right? And so, like all things that I do in my life, I have and am continuing to seek to find specific knowledge to these specific problems, right? Because, again, this is sort of I find this incredibly fascinating that, if you said to a friend, hey, we're going to come with me, we're going to do this sport tonight. It's a sport you've never played before. And they go, yeah, no worries. They'd be pretty humble and pretty quiet and pretty respectful and, all of this sort of stuff, right? And they'd have no opinions, right? I see this all the time. I do a lot of jiu-jitsu, right? I see this all the time. People come in and, you bring a friend and they're normally pretty quiet, like because they want to learn and they respect that they don't know a lot. Or at least, or at least if they're quite egotistical, normally 1 or 2 classes in, that's gone.
Yeah.
Because they've been beaten up by a whole bunch of people, right? Which is, kind of the indoctrination of the sport. Anyway, why is that relevant, right? Well, parenting has this fascinating anomaly that for people, more often than not, who have not done it, so with their first child, they have a whole lot of bloody opinions. Yeah. They think they're really good at it. They think they know a whole bunch of shit. They think that they know what they're doing, and they don't. And that's incredibly scary, but it's also the wonderful part of it, right? It's an incredibly massive challenge, and like I said before, responsibility. So for me, like I started from the position that I know nothing, and then try to figure out how to actually make that work, and then ultimately from my own philosophy in life, like things that I believe to be true and that I believe to be moral, or the virtues or values that I try to uphold. I'm like, well, if that's my belief on what is going to help my children successfully integrate with society, well, my job is exclusively helping to transfer that knowledge, right? Which is hard. Like one of the great examples that I always joke about with my partner Rachel, and a lot of men joke about this, that girl dads, right? Like, I don't ever want my girl to have a boyfriend and do all these things and blah blah blah. And I'm like, I'm excited for that. And then when I say this to people, and they go, oh, what the hell do you mean? I'm like, well, my job is to make sure that I set the male role figure in her life, that the standard is so high that she will choose a tremendously good partner. And one of the best reflections of my success, hopefully, as not only a male role figure, but her, father and friend, and to other children that I'll likely have, that they'll choose a great partner, and that they'll choose great friends, and that they'll have a great job, where great is defined as something that supports them and stimulates them, so that leads them towards their own joy, happiness, and peace, right? But a lot of people, as we've already mentioned, kind of they're trying to find very like a general view to a specific problem, right?
Mate, the greatest compliment I've ever received was probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago from my daughter, my oldest daughter. She's 11 years old, and she said, "Dad, I want to find when I get married, I want that person to be like you." And it was just like,
that's a 10 out of 10 success.
I was speechless to the point it was like almost tears running out of the eyes, because it's just like, well, it's nice because throughout life, you go through these emotions, and you're present, you're not present, you're making choices, you're doing your best, right? We're doing the very best with what we've got, but to have someone come back and go, "Dad, I love and respect you," to the point where I want to find someone who resembles your characteristics, is just probably the greatest compliment that you can get. Now, we can probably go on forever, but I am conscious of your time.
Yeah, a couple of minutes and then we'll
great. Sorry, I can jump straight into quick fire questions now. Happy to do that. And then because you got to be out when? In the next...
about 5 minutes.
Yeah, cool. All right. So conscious of your time, we're going to jump straight into. I think we've rambled on for long enough that we've lost track of time. So, but I want to do is just throw in some quick fire questions before we close up.
Yep.
Given what you know, if you could do all again, would you do it differently?
Two answers. So one, yes, because I would do it much better. But in the same note, I have no regrets about it, in the sense that all of the challenges and learnings and success and failure that I had ultimately has helped me to bring me to the point that I'm in my life now, which I'm quite happy in my life. So commercially, I would do it better. But ultimately, no, I'm glad for how it was.
What excites you about the future?
Building more stuff.
Yeah. So you would do it again?
Oh, yeah. I'm already doing it.
You're already doing it. And you're going to do it better.
Yeah.
Does AI scare you or excite you?
No, I don't. At this point in time, I do not believe that I have a reason to fear it. In the sense that I don't think it's at this point going to come and attack me.
No, it's not Terminator 2 Judgment Day or anything like that.
And I think, like, from a career standpoint, at least at this particular point in time, I think I have very high self-confidence in my abilities to add value to people and businesses. So I think for now that makes me still feel safe. I mean, I look at it as a bit of an amplifier or a force multiplier, if you will. You should be able to achieve a whole lot of things much more efficiently. It's sort of like, horses to car type
agreed.
Scenario.
I think Vaynerchuk came out and said, if you're not introducing AI into your business, you're going to be left behind.
Yeah.
They're going to be... What they're talking about from AI perspective right now is the same as when the internet came out. Like this is the point in time. Yeah.
And it's very, very poorly understood too, like because it's people look at it as a little bit of a black box. It's largely interpretive and mathematical, right? Which basically means that in simple terms, it's a system that can make way better decisions than you will ever be able to, and if not yet, and I mean, that's already it's already sitting Harvard Business School tests and all this sort of stuff, so it's already largely there.
Yeah.
But however many iterations in the future, its ability to make judgment calls, recall information, et cetera, calculate is going to be drastically better than a human will ever be.
Yeah, I think it's exciting. What are you reading right now?
I'm actually, funnily enough, reading a book on professional services.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought off the cuff you knew a fair bit, but
No, I started studying the business model about 3 weeks ago.
So, beautiful. Well, there's a board position open if you want one. Let us know. What self-development book do you feel that stands out? Actually, sorry, jump on back to that book. What book is it?
It's the marketing agency Blueprint, I think that it is. Yeah, so I've reading a whole bunch. I'm reading about every professional service.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Large categories there is, but at the moment I just happen to be on a marketing one, which has been interesting.
Okay, beautiful. Self-development book that stands out from the crowd.
Maybe give two. One that's a bit easier and one that's a bit more challenging. So there's, and I've said this like a lot of times. I think The Courage to Be Disliked, which is like an Adlerian psychology philosophy book, which is told in a story. Funnily enough. Is, in my opinion, one of the most broadly digestible, high value, like self-development books available, and one I've read multiple times. I think if you were someone who like enjoys things a little bit more abstract and like a bit more complex and whatever, there's a book called Objectivism, which is about objectivist philosophy by Ayn Rand, which is. It's very big.
You were reading that recently. Did you post something like that?
Yeah. But that's so like from a when we talk about self-development, understanding self and developing self as opposed to kind of professional development. I'd say that's a pretty insane book. But it's it's like 500+ pages, tiny font, hyper complicated. So it's not for everyone. Yeah.
Read that later.
Yeah.
What's one lesson that's taking the longest to learn?
I think we've spoken a lot today about kind of understanding yourself. I think that we go through these milestones in learning. We go, I had a breakthrough. I learned this. I get it now. The thing that's taken me a long time to learn is that you'll never get it. And that's a really hard thing to kind of accept as truth, but it's highly accurate.
Yeah. It's always a work in progress.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
What's your biggest pet peeve? I think we've answered that one.
I don't know. To be honest, I don't really know if I have any like kind of huge pet peeves.
The get rich quick scheme, I think.
Yeah, I very much don't like those. But more broadly, I think I probably work myself to a point where I am compassionate that people have their views and their views are their views. So,
what's the best advice you've ever received?
That's a very good question. I don't actually know how I would simplify the best advice I've received. As silly as it may sound, the generic phrase would just be, like, what is going to be will be. Like, you can't necessarily always materially affect the outcome. And then so the extension of that is, well, if you can't materially affect the outcome, do the things that you can do within your skill set and then let it be. And that's a very, general... a very, very general response, but that particular remark was made to me in a much more articulate manner by someone when I was right on the cusp of closing, the sweat deal, and I was absolutely confident it was going to fail. And so in moments of like extreme fear, ultimately whether you're afraid or not is irrelevant. Like you can only do what you can do, and what will be will ultimately be. So do the absolute best thing that you can do.
That's it,
and then move on.
If you could have coffee with a historical figure, who would it be?
Historical figure?
Or current figure?
I don't actually know if there's anyone that I would... Like, as in, there's lots of people I'd like to chat to.
Yeah.
One of my things, one of my life views is a lot of people like have these like heroes, and there's always this like don't meet your hero thing.
Yeah.
But I've always... and this is not meant to come across in an arrogant way, but like I've always strived to be my own hero. In the sense that, like accepting that I'm currently not. The future version of myself is what I'm striving to be. So the whole like, who would I want to have coffee with? Well, I would actually like to know in 30 years' time, like what am I like?
Yeah.
And not about what I've achieved. It's like who am I?
Yeah.
Like that would to me would be more important because other people are minor influences, but you still decide. Right? So I've always like looked at myself in 5 or 10 years as being that's what I'm striving towards, and that's who I want to learn from. As strange as that might sound.
No, it's great. Be an interesting conversation on the podcast with Toby in 30 years' time. I'm going to jump a few through. I'm just going to go straight to the end. What's the most useless talent that you have?
Useless talent?
Yeah.
Well, again, it depends on the context, right? But I reckon I make decent pizzas.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I make decent.
That's not useless,
pizzas.
though.
Well, that's what I was saying. I was like, if you want to eat and you like pizza, then that's useful. But otherwise, like it's, I'm full intense with it.
Yeah.
I'm
full
really? Intense with it. Yeah. Like just down to like what's the right type of wood. Yeah, the oils.
Have you got a proper wood?
Yeah, I've got one at home. Yeah.
So you told me where you live earlier. I'll be around for.
Yeah, see you for a meal.
I'm Italian, mate.
Oh, there you go.
Pizza's in my blood. Now you're a father, so you've got to have a dad joke, surely.
Yeah. Oh God, mate, these are good ones put in the spot. I think you need to, if you want the best dad jokes, right? It needs to be like in the moment.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? Yeah. And so yesterday I was doing a strategic planning offsite at a business, for a business, and it was catered for, and a whole bunch of drinks came out, and some of them were orange juices, and this was one of the first times I've ever seen this actually, that the orange juices were brought out in light globes.
Oh, really?
Right, so it was an down light globe, and the cap of the bottle was the bit that you would normally screw into the
that's pretty cool.
light. Anyway, so obviously that then led to a whole bunch of incredibly good puns. On the back of that. Things like say, like this is giving me a bright idea. This juice is really lighting me up. So the vibe in here is really electric. All of that sort of
was
stuff.
that all from you?
That was all from me. Yeah.
And you walked out with a head
Yeah,
roll up.
I was smiling ear to ear, and everyone else in the room was not.
Oh shit! Yeah. I would have lapped it up, mate.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Look, thank you so much for your time, Toby. It's been amazing having you on.
Thanks for hosting.
Someone like, look, age is not really a factor here, but someone as youthful as you and experienced so much with so much knowledge is definitely a testament to you and all the hard work that you've put in over your career. So kudos to everything that you've done and everything that you're going to do, and thank you for sharing your knowledge on the show today.
Thanks for having me, mate. Really appreciate the time and questions.
Beautiful. Thanks, guys. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening to the podcast all. You can check out the show notes if there was anything of interest to you and find out more about us at SynergyIQ.com.au. I am going to ask though, if you did like the podcast, it would absolutely mean the world to me if you could subscribe, rate and review. And if you didn't like it, that's all right too. There's no need to do anything. Take care, guys. All the best.